For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved. But hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, with perseverance we will wait eagerly for it.
Good morning. Today I have an unusual question for you. Have you ever been in a catastrophe? Have you ever looked at your life or the circumstances that are around you and thought, I'm living in a mess. This is a disaster. My life is a catastrophe. Life can surprise you and sometimes disappoint you. We can even surprise and disappoint ourselves, but sometimes what we do is we create catastrophes around ourselves. And it's in the difficulty of a catastrophe that we sometimes ask ourselves, is God still present? Is God still interested? Is God aware? Is he faithful? Does he even care about the circumstances of my life? Some of our friends inside of the BES program, they've seen this starkly. For many of them, they have seen the catastrophes of war and famine and dramatic displacement from their homes. Many of the others of us have seen other kinds of personal catastrophes. The loss of a job, the loss of our health, the loss of our wealth in an economic downturn, the loss of a marriage even, the loss of meaning in retirement. All of these are personal catastrophes where we look at the rubble around us and we think, how did we get into this place? What happens in a catastrophe is we begin to lose hope. And therefore, we begin to wonder, does God care? Is God interested? Is God even aware? This question turns on something fundamental about God. It turns on his character. What is his relationship to desperate catastrophes that happen to be in our lives? Some of us look at our own interior lives and we say the same thing about our interior lives. My life is a catastrophe of some kind. I look at my misbehaviors. I look at my dismal faith. I look at my lazy spiritual disciplines. And I wonder, doesn't all of this test God's character? Isn't he ready to give up? Now, we've been studying the book of Romans, and as you probably know by now, Romans is Paul's most elegant and thorough diagnosis of our situation. And to Paul, things look pretty grim when it comes to humanity. In fact, Paul doesn't use the word, but he would have said, well, it is catastrophic. In fact, humans are so comfortable with sin, we compete with one another to see who can be more outrageous. And that was even before the internet. We live in something like a moral morass where we just don't see goodness as often as we wish. In fact, Dante, who actually comes up with all these levels of hell, I wondered if he would have invented something like this to describe the human condition. So Paul says this is our state of things. It is desperate. It is catastrophic. Now, if you like the Joseph story, which we read just a few minutes ago, the Joseph story is trying to describe a family that has this kind of disastrous life. Here you have a nice 17-year-old young man, like a nice high school kid, who has a slightly overinflated ego. His brothers hate him. They cram him down a well. They change their mind. They pull him out of the well. They sell him to some slave traders. The slave traders go down to Egypt and get rid of him there. He turns into a slave in Egypt, and he turns out serving inside of the Pharaoh's household, and he ends up as a very successful man, still a slave, but still in the dynasty of Pharaoh. By the way, if you ever thought your own family was a catastrophe, just take a look at the Joseph story. But for Paul and the Joseph story in Genesis, we have a probing of a very central question. What is God's relationship to a catastrophe like these? Does God judge them? Is God patient? Is God interested in redeeming them? Is he severe or is he kind? Now, in the last 10 days or so, we have actually witnessed one of the most remarkable catastrophes that we will probably see in the rest of our lifetime. There was an explosion that took place on August 4th in Beirut, Lebanon, beautiful Beirut, whose nickname was the Paris of the Middle East. Let me put just in context what that explosion looked like. What happened was 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded through a fire that was there at the port. Now, ammonium nitrate can be used for farming. It is used for farming generally, but it also can be used for a bomb. It's quite explosive. Now, when 3,000 tons of this exploded at once, it was 1,000 times stronger than the Oklahoma City bombing. Think about that for a minute. Remember in Russia, that disaster at Chernobyl? It was 10 times more powerful than the explosion at Chernobyl. So far in Beirut, they think there are about 250 dead at least, and there are over 1,000 people missing. And most people don't think they will ever find any of their remains. There are also 300,000 people who are homeless in Beirut. It's remarkable. $15 billion of damage. You know, right next to that explosion, you may have seen those large silos at the port. Those were the grain storage system for Lebanon, essentially. They held 15,000 tons of grain. And now all of it's gone. And that too is going to be another disaster. But it's not just this explosion that hit Beirut. The second thing is that they have been dealing with COVID just like we are, and their hospitals are full. But thirdly, Lebanon has been going through this disaster in their economy, real disaster. In fact, in 2019, the Lebanese lira lost 80% of its value. Imagine if all of the money you own right now lost 80% of its value, you would be in shock. Now, I've been corresponding with some pastors who are in Beirut. Some of you may know that I was a student at the American University of Beirut when I was younger as an undergrad. And so I've got a friend, for instance, I've been writing to Riyad Kassis. Riyad has been a pastor in Beirut for some time. And today what he does is he leads up the Langham Trust, which is a part of the John Stott Ministry that gives generous scholarships to developing world young men and women who are doing theology. Now, as we've been emailing, Riyad has been explaining to me what is actually happening on the ground in Beirut where he lives. And he has a daughter. She has a daughter in her early 20s. Her name is Trevina. And Trevina, a couple of days after this explosion, made a video. She is a nursing student at the American University of Beirut. The hospital where she has her internship is down in the blast zone. And this video is absolutely astounding, and Riyad sent it to me. And so I would like to share it with you. Let's take a look.
was supposed to be a normal day. I woke up, got into my car, drove to Beirut, drove by the port, and went to the hospital I am training in. After I finished my training and on my way to my apartment in Ashrafiyye, I said to myself, why stay in Beirut all alone tonight? Let me go home. An hour after I arrived to Zahle, a big explosion hit Beirut. It hit the deepest parts of Beirut and the closest parts to my heart. It hit the roads I was driving in this morning. It hit the hospital I was working at. It hit my apartment and it hit my university, to the point that Beirut was named a disaster zone. Last night, the Lebanese people did not only sleep on a pandemic or an explosion. They slept on a bad economic situation, poverty, hunger, and collapse. Which leads me to ask the question the disciples asked Jesus during the storm. Teacher, do you not care if we drown? And I believe that today we all feel like we are drowning. Especially the people who lost loved ones, lost their homes, their jobs, and everything they've worked for all this time. But I believe that the Lord was there last night. I saw him in every single detail that happened. I saw him in the firefighters that were sacrificing their lives to put out the fire. I saw him in the Red Cross workers that were standing hand in hand with injured people. I saw him in every individual that opened up their homes for strangers who are in need. I saw the Lord in hospitals where doctors and nurses used flashlights because of the lack of electricity to operate on injured individuals. I saw the Lord in every country that sent help to Lebanon and stood with it side by side. And through every phone call and text message that was sent from friends around the globe to ask about their loved ones in Lebanon. I saw the Lord in the crowds of people standing outside the blood banks in Zahle in matters of seconds after the explosion in order to donate blood, and the man standing there giving out water for free. The Lord is around us and is with us and shows us his power through every individual that we meet. We ask for your constant prayer for our country, so the Lord may give us peace and comfort and hope for the future. Because your prayer brings hope to every single individual in Lebanon to continue and to rise above the crisis we are in. Because the Lord says, the righteous will flourish like a palm tree and will grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Min qalbi, salamun li Beirut.
To me, that's a remarkable video. This young woman has just witnessed the destruction of her entire world. Notice how she pivots, though. In the midst of her description, describing a catastrophe that is beyond her imagining, she gives no platitudes, no cliches about how this may have happened, none of the kind of empty things that always annoy us in our own disasters. But she simply says, God has not abandoned Beirut. She says that through the eyes of the faithful, God is visible. Now, when we study Romans, we know that the book of Romans has two important theological sections. There's a series of ethical teachings at the end, but the heart of Romans is 1 through 8 and 9 through 11. We have already completed 1 through 8, and we are now finishing 1 through 11. But I want to show you how each of those major theological sections ends, and then you will make sense of the reading we have in Romans 11 today. In Romans 1 through 8, Paul describes the catastrophe of humanity. And he does it dramatically, and he shows how only with God's intervention does humanity have any hope. In Romans 9 through 11, Paul describes another catastrophe that I'll describe in a moment. But for now, I would like you just simply to look at the end of Romans chapter 8 and remind us that there is, after Paul describes all of the misbehavior and unbelief, Paul says this: is there anything that can separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or explosions, can any of this, nakedness, peril, sword, will it separate us from the love of Christ? No. In all of these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, principalities, nor things present, or things to come, powers, height, steps, anything in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of Christ. So what Paul is saying is that even though he has given this grim diagnosis of our situation, a catastrophic diagnosis, he says, but remember, nothing that we can produce in creation can ever separate us from his profound affections. God still cares. God is still with us. And this is anchored, as I said, to God's character. It's deep in his character to be with us, even in the midst of our disasters. Now, to prove this, what Paul does in his second theological section, Romans 9 through 11, is that Paul then wants to give us a case study of God's faithfulness. And for Paul personally, as a Jew, he sees this as a pretty dramatic spiritual catastrophe. In Romans chapter 9, Paul expresses his anguish. He describes this catastrophe of Israel. How is it that so many Jews missed the Jewish Messiah, that they will not embrace Jesus by faith? Why did Jews reject the Messiah? He describes misdirected religious behavior, and he describes unbelief, and he just can't figure out why it happened. In Romans chapter 10, Paul goes on to express further despair. And he tells us it's possible to be utterly religious and yet miss the very things God has for us in our own time, as Judaism has missed its Messiah. But in Romans chapter 11, where we are now, Paul has hope. And Paul's hope comes in three parts. First, Paul has hope because Gentiles are coming to Jesus. That's amazing. Gentiles are embracing Jesus in faith. So he says this is something to celebrate. Secondly, he says, we should have hope because this is not the catastrophe entirely that you think, because Jews are also coming to Jesus. But Paul says that's the way it's been throughout the Old Testament. There's always been a remnant, a thread of faith running through Jewish history all the way from Abraham. And therefore, today, that's also what we have in this time. But then the third step is remarkable. Here is where Paul has a surprise that no one expects. Paul writes at the end of chapter 11 and acknowledges the severity of the catastrophe, just as he did in chapter 8. But now he's going to talk about unbelieving Israel. So he says in verse 28, as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God, but for your sake. So enemies of God. So therefore they are enemies of the gospel, and therefore these are unbelieving Jews. Amazing. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Now, that means at the end of Romans 8 and at the end of Romans 11, we land on the same spot. No misbehavior, no lack of faith will ever end God's affection for you. Never. It just won't happen. And Israel is proof. If unbelieving Israel still has a place in God's love, so do you, and so do I. Therefore, there is no catastrophe, either in our world or in our lives, that can ever be employed to say that God has abandoned the scene. He has not abandoned us. He never will. God is always present, loving, redeeming, restoring us amidst the catastrophes that we create. And of course, this is the great conclusion of the Joseph story that we also finished today. In the Joseph story, of course, Joseph has this remarkable, distressing experience But then he ends up being the great supplier of grain in a famine for all of his family. And we learn that God has delighted in intervening in that story and bringing what was meant for evil into something good. God was present in Egypt with Joseph and participated in the redemption of that moment. If you have ever thought that God has abandoned you, if you have ever despaired because of your behavior, your unbelief, maybe even the circumstances of your life, think again. The clarion call of the gospel is God's character is centered on his faithfulness, and he will never stop loving and standing with you. Amen.